In April, reinforcements dispatched to 3 Corps in Western Australia and to Northern Territory Force at Darwin raised each to division strength, plus certain auxiliaries. Small Air Force elements were maintained in each locality, and aerodrome facilities were expanded to accommodate major striking forces for projected operations, as the centre of gravity of the Allied air forces moved forward. Naval protection at this time was limited to 2 light cruisers and a number of destroyers and submarines based at Fremantle. After the Japanese occupation of Rabaul and the New Guinea coast, the most pressing danger facing General MacArthur was a potential enemy thrust toward Port Moresby in preparation for a drive against Australia. Consistent with his strategy of defending Australia in New Guinea, General MacArthur decided to strengthen immediately the Allied position in Papua and develop Port Moresby as a major air and land base. Port Moresby, flanked on the east by Milne Bay and protected on the north by the formidable 14,000-foot Owen Stanley Range, was strategically well placed. Except for its vulnerability to amphibious assault, it was ideally situated for future air operations against enemy positions to the north and northeast. A strong base in this region would not only serve to protect Australia from hostile raids, but also provide the starting point on the road back to the Philippines, the heart of the enemy's supply and communications network in his newly conquered empire. Constant enemy air raids and the lack of adequate aerodrome facilities made Port Moresby virtually untenable for big bombers, except as a forward fueling point. The nearest supporting airfields were at Townsville, 700 miles to the south. To strengthen his Port Moresby base, General MacArthur planned to move his bombers into more forward positions. A program of aerodrome construction was undertaken in Australia, first expanding installations in the Townsville-Cloncurry area, then building north along the York Peninsula. This development was in its early stages when, at the end of April, the presence of a large Japanese naval force in the Mandated Islands and concentrations of aircraft in the New Britain Solomons region indicated that the enemy was about to renew his offensive. To meet this threat, General MacArthur ordered the Allied air forces to intensify their reconnaissance, assemble a maximum striking force on the Townsville-Cloncurry airfields, and bomb enemy positions. During the first week in May, the important stronghold of Rabaul was attacked repeatedly. Missions were also sent against Lae, Buka, and De Boyne Islands, as well as enemy convoys in adjacent waters. Garrison commanders in northeastern Australia and at Port Moresby were alerted to the possibility of landings in their respective areas. Allied Naval Forces, SWPA, dispatched 3 cruisers to augment the Pacific Fleet units, which already included the aircraft carriers Lexington and Yorktown. Every measure was taken to check the threatened enemy advance. The Allied countermeasures were soon justified. 8 days after General MacArthur had issued orders for the all-out alert, the Japanese made their first move. On the 3rd of May, an enemy naval force made an unopposed landing at Tulagi Harbour in the southern Solomons. The next morning, however, the Yorktown, which had been refuelling at Espiritu Santo, made a high-speed run north and launched its planes in 3 strikes against harbour shipping, crippling a destroyer and 3 or 4 small boats. It then returned southward to rejoin the Lexington. While the occupation of Tulagi was being carried out, the main force of the Japanese Fourth Fleet was completing its final preparations for a full-scale amphibious invasion of Port Moresby. The decision to take Port Moresby had been made on the 29th of January, and specific orders to the 5th Carrier Division were issued in the middle of April. The landings were to take place on the 10th of May. On the 1st of May, a strong fleet of Japanese warships, including the carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku of the 5th Carrier Division, left Truk to follow a route through the Mandated Islands around San Cristobal and into the Coral Sea. The main missions of this task force were to protect the Port Moresby landing group and to engage the Allied fleet, which was expected to appear on the scene. Meanwhile, the Japanese South Seas Detachment, a veteran unit that had already taken Guam, Rabaul, and Salamaua, had been designated as the invasion landing force under Major General Tomitaro Horai. This group, loaded on approximately 12 transports, departed from Rabaul on the 4th of May, escorted by 1 light cruiser and 6 destroyers, and also supported by the carrier Shoho and 4 heavy cruisers. Long-range land-based bombers from General MacArthur's command were combing the area for the Japanese convoy, but failed to locate it either that day or the next. On the 5th, however, Allied intelligence reported that Port Moresby was the main enemy objective, and that landings could be expected any time between the 5th of May and the 10th of May. B-17S and B-26S of the Southwest Pacific area stood by on alert to attack, while other planes carried out neutralizing raids to keep enemy land-based air power from participating in the coming battle. It was not until late on the 6th that 3 B-17S on reconnaissance duty finally located the Japanese invasion force headed for the Jomard Passage and the Louisiade Islands. Rear ADM Frank J. Fletcher, commander of the Allied fleet, dispatched a group of cruisers and destroyers to cover the Jomard Passage and moved north with his carrier force to contact and close with the main enemy fleet. On the morning of the 7th of May, Army scout planes reported sighting an enemy carrier, which proved to be the Shoho off Mishima Island. 10 BXEs immediately were sent to the attack. They were generally unsuccessful in their high-level bombing, but were able to start fires on 1 cruiser, and, by throwing the Japanese formation into complete disorder, they caused the carrier to reverse its course. Flyers from the Lexington and the Yorktown arrived shortly thereafter, catching the Japanese in a state of unpreparedness, with few planes in the air and their carrier headed away from the wind. 9 bomb hits and 4 torpedoes sank the Shoho within 5 minutes after the first blow was scored. A second strike at the retiring enemy force was readied, but not ordered aloft because the other Japanese carriers had not yet been located. The undiscovered Shokaku and Zuikaku were at this time to the northeast, busily searching for the United States carriers. Reconnaissance planes from these 2 enemy ships misdirected a heavy attack against a group of oil tankers, mistaking them for a carrier task force. Admiral Fletcher did not learn of this attack until dusk, too late to take any effective counteraction. The Japanese learned of the sinking of the Shoho as their planes were returning from the attack on the tanker group, and at dusk, about 27 bombers and torpedo planes again left the Shokaku and Zuikaku in another effort to locate and sink the Lexington and the Yorktown. After a fruitless search of almost 300 miles, the planes were forced to jettison all bombs and torpedoes and swing back to their ships. During the return flight, these planes passed over the United States carriers at night, and some landings were actually attempted before the Japanese pilots realized their mistake. Both sides initiated all-out attacks on the 8th of May. About mid-morning, United States carrier planes scored 3 hits on the Shokaku, which was forced to retire. At the same time that the Shokaku was undergoing attack, planes from the Shokaku and Zuikaku were attacking the Lexington and Yorktown. Early in the afternoon, the Lexington, put out of control by enemy attacks, was abandoned and sunk by its own destroyer escorts. The Yorktown was damaged, but remained operational. This exchange terminated one of the most unusual battles in the annals of naval warfare. Not only was it the first engagement between carrier forces in history, but surface ships did not exchange a single shot throughout the entire battle. In addition to reconnaissance and preparatory raids against enemy air installations, land-based aircraft from the SWPA supported the action of the naval forces by flying some 45 sorties against the enemy fleet. Bad weather intervened, however, and frustrated all attempts to bomb the crippled Shokaku, which succeeded in escaping to the sanctuary of Rabaul. The Battle of the Coral Sea prevented the Japanese from occupying Port Moresby by sea and temporarily delayed their plans to capture Guadalcanal and occupy the Solomons. The race against time by the Allies had now become a split-second effort to develop the northeastern Australia-New Guinea area. The construction of airdromes at Cairns, Cooktown, Cowan, Horn Island and Port Moresby was pushed rapidly, and small garrisons were provided for the airdromes on the York Peninsula and at Port Moresby. On the other hand, the Allied victory was a purely defensive one. Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific were still unable to launch a major offensive. The Japanese had lost an important battle, but the strategic initiative still remained in their hands. Kanga Force was formed in April 1942 to harass and interrupt the development of the Japanese bases at Leh and Salamaua. This force consisted of a small formation of local Europeans known as the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles and a reinforced Australian independent company. A part of the force was already at WAU, a pre-war gold mining town in the Owen Stanleys, from which trails led to Leh and Salamaua. Additional troops were flown in from Port Moresby during the latter part of May. At the beginning of May, General MacArthur suggested to General Blamey that ground raids be initiated against Leh and Salamaua to destroy enemy installations and, if possible, to occupy the airfields. If Leh and Salamaua could be denied to the enemy for a limited period, and the airfields used by Allied pursuit planes, valuable time would be gained for strengthening the defences at Port Moresby. Toward the end of May, as Kanga Force was making preparations to launch raids on Leh and Salamaua, scout reports indicated that the Japanese themselves were about to move into the Bulolo Valley against Wau. The Kanga Force commander, Major N.L. Flea, was committed to the defence of the important air installations at Wau, but with the small force available, he was unable to protect the airfields and carry out offensive operations against Leh and Salamaua simultaneously. The raids, therefore, were postponed for a later date. The planned attacks were finally made at the end of June, and although some damage and casualties were inflicted on the enemy, no decisive results were obtained. Kanga Force was maintained at WAU after these raids under almost prohibitive conditions to continue the protection of air facilities and to secure the crest of the Owen Stanleys in that area. Battle of Midway. While the Southwest Pacific area was thus engaged, another naval battle was being fought in the Central Pacific that considerably altered the general strategic situation. Soon after the retirement of the Japanese from the Coral Sea, a powerful concentration of enemy naval forces in home waters was reported. The United States Pacific Fleet prepared to meet an attack eastward. On the 3rd of June, the enemy was sighted southwest of Midway Island. Beginning that afternoon and continuing for the next 3 days, land-based planes from Midway and carrier aircraft from the Yorktown, Enterprise and Hornet repeatedly battered the Japanese ships, sinking 4 aircraft carriers and 1 heavy cruiser. 1 heavy cruiser was severely damaged, in addition to 2 destroyers. American losses were light, consisting of the Yorktown and 1 destroyer. Again, as in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the opposing warships never once sighted each other, and not a single direct shot was exchanged. The dominant role of air power in naval warfare was now clearly demonstrated. This decisive victory restored the balance of naval power in the Pacific and automatically removed the threat to Hawaii and the west coast of the United States. Thereafter, except for the Aleutians, where the Japanese had landed on Attu and Kiska Islands, enemy operations were confined to the South and Southwest Pacific areas, Milne Bay and Maroke. Whereas the Battle of Midway compelled the Japanese to concentrate their attention on the New Guinea area, the Battle of the Coral Sea pointed to the strategic importance of Milne Bay. It convinced the Japanese that a base at that location would be invaluable for the air support of any future convoy rounding the southeastern tip of Papua. It also disclosed another line of approach to Port Moresby, the coastal trails along which ground troops could infiltrate to divert Allied strength from its defences and to reinforce Japanese troops attacking over the Owen Stanley Mountains. General MacArthur was equally aware of the strategic potentialities of Milne Bay. He fully realised not only its importance to the enemy, but also its value to his own scheme of offence. While affording a powerful barrier against any Japanese attack, the Owen Stanley Mountains also presented an obstacle to Allied advance. An Allied base at Milne Bay would pave the way for a move around the end of New Guinea and along the Papuan coast to Buna and thence to the main objectives of Leh and Salamaua, avoiding the mountains entirely. With Milne Bay in Allied hands, the east flank of Port Moresby would be secured. Accordingly, in June, General MacArthur ordered the secret construction of an air, land and naval base at Gili Gili, located at the head of Milne Bay. The move along the coast to the site of the projected base, known as Operation Fall River, was made secretly and skillfully, so that the initial execution of the plan was unhampered by enemy opposition. Had the Japanese been aware of General MacArthur's intention to fortify Milne Bay, they would have made every effort to prevent its fulfillment. This was clearly demonstrated by the fury and determination of their counterattacks as soon as they learned that he had beaten them to that all-important position. In addition to the cover afforded by the air forces at Darwin and on the York Peninsula, General MacArthur directed the construction of an airdrome at Meroke on the southern coast of Dutch New Guinea as further protection for his west flank. Although the project had to be temporarily suspended in August because the engineer effort was required elsewhere, a garrison of 1 infantry company and auxiliaries was kept at Meroke to deny its use to the Japanese. Kokoda Trail. General MacArthur also anticipated enemy efforts along the Kokoda Trail, the only passable route across the mountains from Buna on the East Papuan coast to Port Moresby. He was convinced that the Japanese intended to employ this route either to assault Port Moresby directly or as a supply base for a possible amphibious force attacking by sea through the Louisiade archipelago. To forestall such a move, he asked General Blamey to advise him of the plan of the New Guinea force for the protection of Kokoda and the points along the trail. General MacArthur's estimate of the enemy's intention was strikingly correct. 3 days after this query to General Blamey, Imperial Japanese headquarters ordered the commander of the Japanese 17th Army to cooperate with the Navy and immediately make land attack plans against Port Moresby. On the 21st of June, the Australian Maroubra Force, consisting of the Papuan Infantry Battalion and a battalion of the 30th Brigade, was organised for concentration at Kokoda on the northern slopes of the Owen Stanleys northeast of Port Moresby. It was directed to prevent an enemy penetration of the mountains along the route of the Kokoda Trail. The Papuan Infantry Battalion, about 280 native troops with white officers, was already north of the range, and a company of the brigade started forward overland in early July. The remainder stayed at Port Moresby to assist in strengthening the southern terminus of the Kokoda Trail and to reinforce the advance detachment if necessary. In addition to defending the passes along the Owen Stanleys, General MacArthur worked out a plan for the occupation of key points along the Kokoda Trail from Port Moresby to Buna. This plan, designated as Operation Providence, called for an overland force to proceed from Port Moresby to Buna. Upon arrival at Buna, this force would meet a light convoy proceeding up the coast from Milne Bay. The commander of the overland expedition, utilising the supplies and equipment of this light convoy, would then form a beachhead to cover the landing of a second and main convoy proceeding from Milne Bay. According to this plan, the main convoy would contain the personnel for airdrome construction and garrison units, as well as necessary supplies. Intelligence in operations. General MacArthur's plan to penetrate deeply into the difficult and largely unknown terrain held by the Japanese required special preparation and the collection of new information. New Guinea was a wilderness compared with Western Europe, where professional armies in being for over a century had left a rich heritage of military and topographical information. The amount of material on the geography and topography of New Guinea and adjacent areas, however, was inadequate. Available hydrographic charts were old and faulty, and data on health and climatic conditions peculiar to these regions were meagre. Information concerning the activity of the enemy, his strength and dispositions, his combat methods and current equipment, and his actual relationships with the natives was imperative. Such intelligence would have to be obtained by secret operations behind the enemy lines and from other sources. General MacArthur directed that special agencies be developed to provide him with this information. On the 19th of July 1942, the Allied Geographical Section, AGS, was formed to assemble and evaluate all geographic information regarding the Southwest Pacific area. The primary task of the new section was to prepare and publish reports and locality studies on areas of immediate tactical interest in New Guinea, New Britain, New Ireland, and the Solomons. Subsequently, more extensive terrain studies were issued to all planning staffs, supplemented by pocket-sized handbooks supplied to troops in the field, down to platoon commanders, as a sort of individual Baedeker for the assault echelons when they hit the landing beaches. The Allied Intelligence Bureau, AIB, was established in July 1942 to collect intelligence through clandestine operations behind enemy lines. A secondary function was to conduct sabotage operations and to secure cooperation and aid from the natives in fighting the Japanese. The Bureau incorporated several previously existing agencies and absorbed the Royal Australian Navy's coast watching system. It dispatched agents and radio transmitters by submarine and established stations ranging from Bougainville to Borneo, from Papua to Palawan. This organisation performed invaluable service by giving immediate reports via radio on Japanese plane and ship movements in the area from the Solomons to New Ireland, New Britain, and the mainland of New Guinea. Plate number 16. This information enabled Allied planes to be ready and in the air at a time when the Allies were relatively weak in air power. Operational areas of New Guinea were explored by parties sent in by AIB to ascertain Japanese strength, activities and movements. Intelligence was radioed for strategic use directly to local force commanders, Air Force units and the Navy, as well as to AIB headquarters in Brisbane and Port Moresby. The coastal waters between Milne Bay and Boona were sounded, charted and marked by secret buoys to guide the transports of proposed landing operations. Experience on Bataan with a handful of Nisei interpreters had clearly shown the potentialities of a competent interrogation and translation service. Out of this experience grew one of General MacArthur's most important single intelligence agencies, the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, which was organised on the 9th of September 1942. Invaluable results were achieved by ATIS personnel in neutralising one of the greatest advantages possessed by the Japanese, a language that was almost as effective as a secret code. The Japanese had found early in the war that they could label their minefields, carry personal diaries, use their spoken language freely, and even handle military documents with little regard for security. With complete confidence in the Nisei, G2 employed hundreds of second-generation Japanese from Hawaii and California in linguist detachments to be sent into the field with the combat forces. ATIS intelligence teams accompanied the troops in all initial landing operations. Captured maps and orders processed by ATIS revealed enemy strength, dispositions, and plans of attack. Diaries contained excellent clues about the psychology and morale of the Japanese troops. Other documents indicated the enemy's problems with food and supply, his order of battle, the effect of our air attacks, his relations with the natives, the relative effectiveness of Allied and Japanese weapons, and other equally important data. Spot interrogations of prisoners taken in battle were sometimes so important that they caused a shift in Allied plans of attack. ATIS provided information of immediate operational as well as overall strategic value. These intelligence agencies combined to furnish the Southwest Pacific Area, SWPA, with its own Office of Strategic Services. As the war progressed, they were enlarged and coordinated to meet the immediate needs of each new tactical and strategic situation. By using this weapon of superior intelligence, General MacArthur was in a position to gain the greatest strategic advantage in the shortest time with minimum losses. On the 20th of July, General MacArthur transferred his entire headquarters from Melbourne to Brisbane, bringing with it forward echelons of all component forces, ground, air and navy. Brig General Richard J. Marshall replaced General Barnes in command of United States Army Forces in Australia, which was redesignated United States Army Services of Supply, and Major General George C. Kenny relieved General Brett as commander of Allied Air Forces. The Allied successes in the Coral Sea and at Midway created a new situation that General MacArthur urged should be exploited by immediate offensive action. In a radio to the War Department on the 8th of June, he outlined his plans and recommendations, emphasizing the necessity of speed in their execution. The first objective should be the new Britain-New Ireland area, against which I would move immediately if the means were available. I have the 2nd and 4th Infantry Divisions and the 7th Australian Division, which can be used in support of a landing force, but which cannot be employed in the initial attack due to lack of specialised equipment and training. naval component excellent but lacks integral air elements. I recommend one division trained and equipped for amphibious operations and a task force, including 2 carriers, be made available to me at the earliest practicable date. With such a force, I could retake that important area. Speed is vital. It is not possible for me to act quickly if I must build equipment and train my divisions. I cannot urge too strongly that the time has arrived to use the force, or a portion of it, which you have informed me to be 40,000 men on the West Coast, USA, trained for amphibious operations, and could be employed in conjunction with the forces available to me in the initiation of offensive operations in the SWPA. On the 24th of June, General MacArthur elaborated on his plan for an offensive along the northeast coast of New Guinea and in the New Britain-New Ireland area. He stressed the important strategic principles of concentration of forces and the selection of objectives that could be held once they were won. An operation against Timor had been proposed, but General MacArthur doubted whether Timor could be held in proximity to strong Japanese bases in the Netherlands East Indies and with the Japanese in complete control of the adjacent sea areas. He was opposed to any division of the Allied effort and, rather than dissipate limited strength in various areas, he proposed a single unified drive under unified command. It is impracticable to attempt the capture of Rabaul by direct assault supported by the amount of land-based aviation now available. My plan contemplates a progressive movement involving primary action against the Solomons and the north coast of New Guinea in order to protect the naval surface forces and to secure airfields from which essential support can be given to the forces participating in the final phase of the operation. It is necessary that all ground operations in this area be under my direction. To bring in land forces from other areas with a view to their operation under naval direction exercised from distant points can result in nothing but complete confusion. The very purpose of the establishment of the Southwest Pacific area was to obtain unity of command. The action projected northwest of Australia, attack on Timor, even if successful, could not be supported, as is the case in the New Britain area. It is doubtful whether Timor could be held under present circumstances in view of nearby Japanese bases and their control of the sea. Its capture should not be undertaken unless we are prepared to support it fully, which includes the continuous control of the sea lane between there and Australia. The situation is entirely different in the New Britain-New Ireland area, which if captured can unquestionably be held. No effort from the northwest coast of Australia should be made until naval and air forces are built up that will ensure retention of objectives. If correct command procedures are not followed, it makes a mockery of the unity of command theory, which was the basis of the organizational plan applied to the Pacific Theatre. On the 2nd of July, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a directive under which Admiral Gormley was assigned the conquest and garrisoning of the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions. General MacArthur's task was to capture the remaining Solomon Islands and also Lae, Salamaua, and the northeast coast of New Guinea. The target date for the first operation against the Solomon Islands was set as the 7th of August. The task would not be easy. The enemy was bringing large reinforcements into the region of the projected offensive and was intensifying his efforts to complete airstrips at the key points of Kavieng, Rabaul, Lae, Salamaua, Buka, and Guadalcanal. The Allies, on the other hand, lacked trained amphibious forces. They were short on shipping facilities and airfields, and they needed experienced pilots and more planes to counter Japanese power. Plans for the offensive, however, were rushed. Operation Tulsa envisioned 2 drives. One force would proceed generally along the north coast of New Guinea, securing in succession Lae, Salamaua, Gasmata, Cape Gloucester, Talasea, Madang, and Wewak Lorengau. The other force would follow along the Solomons to New Ireland, seizing Faisi, Kieta, Buka, and Kavieng. In addition to his operations in New Guinea, General MacArthur prepared to support the attack on Guadalcanal by interdicting hostile air and naval activities in the area west of the Solomons. Air Force units were being moved into Cape York Peninsula and New Guinea as rapidly as the completion of airstrips and limited shipping allowed. By the 19th of August, 4 airfields had been completed at Port Moresby, 1 for heavy bombers, 1 for medium bombers, and 2 for fighters. 2 more heavy bomber fields and 1 for medium bombers were expected to be ready by the 5th of September. At Milne Bay, 1 field, already in operation for pursuit planes, was to be ready for heavy bombers by the 25th of August, and 2 other heavy bomber strips were under construction. On Cape York Peninsula, 2 fields for heavy bombers and 1 for fighters were completed, with 3 additional heavy bomber fields planned for September. Adequate service facilities had been completed in the Townsville-Cloncurry area. The acceleration of air movements and the construction of air establishments were early characteristics of General MacArthur's strategy in 3-dimensional warfare. His complete air-mindedness is demonstrated by the principle of moving his bomber line forward. 1. Advancing in successive bounds. 2. Establishing forward airfields. And 3. Making the next move under cover of his own air umbrella. The United States 32nd and 41st Divisions were shifted to Brisbane and Rockhampton, respectively, to train for offensive operations. These divisions, formed into a corps, were to be placed under the command of Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger, Commanding General, 1st Corps, en route from the United States. By early August, plans and preparations for the offensive had proceeded to such a point that General MacArthur was ready to execute the first phase, the capture of Boona, Lae, Salamaua, and Gasmata, upon the successful conclusion of Admiral Gormley's operation at Guadalcanal. While these preparations were underway, the Japanese were pursuing their own plans for taking Port Moresby. After the Midway debacle, Imperial General Headquarters cancelled the plans for operations against Samoa, New Caledonia, and the Fiji Islands, and ordered the commander of the Japanese 17th Army to concentrate his efforts on securing eastern New Guinea. As a result of these orders, the Allied move to execute Operation Providence and seize Boona was checked. On the 21st of July, a strong convoy of Japanese transports and warships landed near Basabua, northwest of Boona. Although the convoy was sighted and attacked by Allied planes, General MacArthur's air force was as yet too small to effect any serious damage. Japanese troops occupied the Boona area immediately and dispatched a spearhead inland towards Kokoda, the first elements in the overland drive to Port Moresby. Their only opposition was a small advance detachment of Australians, carrying out Operation Providence, which had just completed an exhausting march from Port Moresby to the outskirts of Boona. The Australians, heavily outnumbered and operating against adverse terrain factors, were forced to begin a slow retreat that did not stop until the enemy had reached a point within 20 airline miles of Port Moresby. On the 23rd of July, the first ground action between the opposing forces in New Guinea took place at Awala. The Australians were forced to give way after it became obvious that they could not hope to withstand increasing enemy pressure from the beachhead area. On the 25th of July, after breaking out of an enemy encirclement near Oivi, the Australians fell back to Deniki, a few miles south of Kokoda Airdrome. When the Japanese at first failed to occupy Kokoda itself, the Australians on the 28th of July moved back to the airfield. That night, however, the Japanese, also recognizing the importance of the airstrip for supply, launched a heavy attack that drove the Australians once more to Deniki. A counterattack on 10, the 11th of August, proved futile, and the Australians were forced to evacuate Deniki and retreat to Isurava, 3 miles south of Kokoda. Both sides were making every effort to increase their strength at this stage. The Australians planned to build Isurava into a base from which they could attack and reoccupy Kokoda. Once in possession of the airstrip on the Kokoda Plateau, they could receive air reinforcements from Port Moresby and drive the Japanese back to the coast. The Japanese likewise planned to build Kokoda into a large forward supply base. As companies of Australian infantry were trickling through the Owen Stanleys to bolster the battle-weary forces at Isurava, the Japanese were dispatching troops from Rabaul for the final all-out drive on Port Moresby. The main strength of the South Seas detachment had arrived at Basabua, near Boona, during 13, the 21st of August, under orders to proceed to Port Moresby. On the 18th of August, Lieutenant General Sidney F. Rowell replaced Major General Basil M. Morris as commander of New Guinea Force. Major General Arthur S. Allen was put in charge of the Australian 7th Division and made responsible for operations on the Kokoda Trail. The troops at Isurava had been reinforced by the 2nd Battalion of the 30th Brigade and 2 battalions of the 21st Brigade. By the 26th of August, the date on which the Australians were to have launched their counterattack, the enemy himself was applying heavy pressure on Isurava. Outflanked and outnumbered, the Australians were pushed back along the trail. Attempts to supply them by air were abortive, as supplies were either smashed or lost in the airdrops. The reinforcements which were to have ousted the Japanese from Kokoda were now forced to assume the defensive and to help extricate the battered remnants of the forces retreating from Isurava. General MacArthur was faced with the grim task of halting a Japanese drive which, if successful, would not only disrupt the Allied timetable in the Southwest Pacific, but could mean an eventual struggle for Australia itself. Admiral Gormley launched his scheduled attack against the Solomons on the 7th of August, when the 1st Marine Division, reinforced, went ashore at Tulagi and on Guadalcanal. 3 aircraft carriers were among the participating naval units, which also included several cruisers and destroyers temporarily assigned to Admiral Gormley's control from General MacArthur's naval forces. General MacArthur did everything in his power to assist the landing operation and to support the Solomons' offensive. Submarines were dispatched to operate in the vicinity of Rabaul, reconnaissance was intensified, and air attacks against enemy airfields and shipping were pressed vigorously. All planes capable of the range were directed against Rabaul, Buka, and Kieta, while others struck at Lae and Salamaua. Land operations in New Guinea were also intensified to relieve the pressure on the Solomons. The marine landings at Tulagi and Guadalcanal took the enemy garrisons by surprise. At the end of the 2nd day, the Marines were in complete control of Tulagi and held the airfield on Guadalcanal, the immediate objectives of the operation. The Japanese, however, struck back viciously by sea and air from their bases in the northern Solomons and the Bismarck archipelago. On the night of the 8th of August, hostile surface units entered the area between Guadalcanal and Florida Island undetected and sank the cruisers Canberra, Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria, and badly damaged the Chicago and 2 destroyers. Enemy land-based planes began bombing marine positions during daylight hours, and submarines were active against the American lines of communication. At night, enemy warships bombarded shore installations virtually at will. On the 23rd of August, a heavily guarded convoy of transports was sighted moving south of Rabaul. The Allied fleet took partial revenge for its earlier losses, as carrier aircraft combined with land-based planes from Guadalcanal and the Southwest Pacific area succeeded in inflicting damage that turned the enemy back. The Japanese, however, were able to land additional troops on Guadalcanal by means of the Tokyo Express, fast night runs by destroyers from the northern Solomons, and the Marines defending the airfield faced increasing pressure. The campaign became a race to see which side could build up the greater number of reinforcements and supplies, the outcome depending upon control of the sea and air. Intelligence, meanwhile, indicated that the Japanese had discovered the Allied occupation of Milne Bay. General MacArthur anticipated that the enemy, incensed at having been forestalled, would soon attempt retaliatory measures. Preparing for such a move, he secretly dispatched the Australian 18th Brigade to reinforce the 7th Brigade, which had been sent in July to garrison the airfield. In addition to these 2 brigades, the forces at Milne Bay included some 1,300 United States combat and service troops. They were under the command of Major General Cyril A. Close, who arrived on the 13th of August to take charge of the forces in that area. Air power consisted of 2 fighter squadrons and part of a Hudson bomber squadron based on the Milne Airdrome. The first indications of a Japanese attack became evident on the 24th of August, when 7 enemy barges were sighted moving down the Papuan coast, midway between Buna and Milne Bay. An air raid on Milne Bay by about 12 Japanese fighters was carried out on the same day. On the 25th of August, the enemy barges were discovered beached off Cape Varietta on Goodenough Island. They were immediately strafed and destroyed by Allied planes. A more dangerous threat, however, appeared on the 25th in the form of an enemy convoy of 9 vessels moving southward from the direction of Rabaul past the Trobriands and Normanby Island. Bad weather hampered efforts to bomb the convoy, which subsequently succeeded in landing over 1,100 troops by power barge near Wagga Wagga and Wanadala. Japanese warships moved into the bay under cover of darkness to shell Allied positions, and then, covered by heavy mists, retreated to open waters by dawn. Enemy troops put ashore initially and later as reinforcements numbered slightly over 1,900 men. The Japanese proceeded with the operations, unaware of the secret Allied reinforcement of their Milne Bay garrison. The first important clash of the opposing forces took place near KB Mission, a few miles west of Wagga Wagga. The enemy, bringing ashore light tanks in addition to mortars and 25-pounders, pushed the defenders back beyond the mission to the west bank of the Gamma River. By dawn of the 27th, the fighting had moved still further back toward Numble 3 airstrip. Here the Allies had drawn up a strong defence line hidden in the wooded area on the edge of the strip. For 3 days the enemy did his utmost to advance, but was unable to pass the strip defences. Finally, on the 30th of August, having been hastily reinforced on the previous night by the 3rd Kure Special Landing Party, the Japanese launched a determined attack in force. They came forward in repeated and furious charges backed by field pieces and heavy machine guns, but a solid wall of Allied fire prevented a single Japanese from crossing the strip. The attack was repulsed, and the enemy suffered heavily. That night marked the turning point of the battle. With their tanks bogged in mud, their task force commander and most of their officers killed, their rations almost exhausted, and their equipment unsuited for the terrain and climate around Milne Bay, the Japanese began to crumble rapidly. The Allies, seizing the advantage, started their counterattack. Moving rapidly across Number 3 airstrip, past the Gamma River, they reoccupied KB Mission. In the early morning of the 2nd of September, the advance was continued. On the 5th of September, the enemy was driven from his position at Wagga Wagga, thus putting an end to organised resistance. Several pockets farther east were cleaned out by air strafing and artillery. The Japanese managed to evacuate about 300 of their troops on the evening of the 5th of September, abandoning the remainder to the jungle. Some of these hapless troops tried to make their way over the Stirling Range and along the coast to rejoin their forces at Buna. Some were caught in the lower foothills and in the native villages near Ahioma at the eastern end of the bay. Others who had succeeded in crossing the range were found and killed near Taupota on the north shore. The rest died of starvation and disease along the coast. Despite their incompetent leadership, the Japanese troops at Milne Bay fought bravely and tenaciously to the bitter end. A grim foretaste of the future was to be found in the fact that at one phase of the operations, nearly 700 Japanese were killed, and only 3, 2 of whom later died, were taken prisoner. Wounded Japanese who could not be evacuated were shot by their own men. General MacArthur analysed the significance of the early operations in New Guinea as follows. This operation represents another phase in the pattern of the enemy's plans to capture Port Moresby. This citadel is guarded by the natural defence line of the Owen Stanley Range. The first effort was to turn its left flank from Leh and Salamaua, which proved impracticable. He then launched an attack in large, on-low force against its rear. This was repulsed and dissipated by air and sea action in the Coral Sea. He then tried to pierce the centre in a weak attempt by way of Buna Gona Kokoda, subjecting himself to extraordinary air losses because of the extreme vulnerability of his exposed position. His latest effort was to turn the right flank by a surprise attack at Milne Bay. The move was anticipated, however, and prepared for with great care. With complete secrecy, the position was occupied by our forces and converted into a strong point. The enemy fell into the trap with disastrous results to him. The enemy, in the meantime, had not diminished his pressure along the Kokoda Trail. Australian units arriving from Port Moresby were immediately committed to stemming the steady advance of determined Japanese troops. There was no opportunity to choose advantageous positions or to build elaborate defences. Fighting took place wherever the enemy was encountered. During September, the Australians continued to withdraw, still fighting tenaciously and gallantly under conditions of extraordinary hardship and difficulty, as General MacArthur phrased it. From Isurava, they fell back across the gap, but were again outflanked by Japanese infiltration tactics, despite concentrated Allied bombing and strafing attacks from the air. On the 14th of September, the Australians took up a last desperate stand at Imita Ridge. This ridge, within view of the sea on the Australian side, was the final remaining hurdle before Port Moresby. Here the line held. The Japanese, having left the comparatively smooth slopes of their initial advance from Buna, had begun to experience increasing difficulties with the terrain and their extended, tenuous lines of supply. Casualties from bombing, sickness, and shortages of food had exacted a heavy toll. A mere 20 airline miles from his long-sought goal, the difficulties of the situation forced the Japanese commander to halt and consolidate his worn forces and await reinforcements of men and supplies. His grim story of the battle for the Kokoda Trail, told a short time before his death, is revealed by General Horai in a proclamation to his troops. 1. Repeatedly we were in hot pursuit of the enemy. We smashed his final resistance in the fierce fighting at Ioribaiwa, and today we firmly hold the heights of that area, the most important point for the advance on Port Moresby. 2. For more than 3 weeks during that period, every unit forced its way through deep forests and ravines and climbed scores of peaks in pursuit of the enemy. Traversing knee-deep mud, clambering up steep precipices, bearing uncomplainingly the heavy weight of artillery and ammunition, our men overcame the shortage of supplies, and we succeeded in surmounting the Stanley Range. No pen or word can depict adequately the magnitude of the hardships suffered. From the bottom of our hearts, we appreciate these many hardships and deeply sympathise with the great number killed and wounded. 3. We will strike a hammer blow at the stronghold of Moresby. However, ahead of us, the enemy still crawls about. It is difficult to judge the direction of his movements, and many of you have not yet fully recovered your strength. I feel keenly that it is increasingly important during this present period, while we are waiting for an opportunity to strike, to strengthen our positions, reorganize our forces, replenish our stores, and recover our physical fitness. 4. When next we go into action, this unit will throw in its fighting power unreservedly. In spite of the victory at Milne Bay and the checking of the enemy on the Kokoda Trail, General MacArthur felt that the overall situation was becoming increasingly precarious. During July and August, the Japanese had been steadily pouring planes and ships into the Truk Rabul region, and after their defeat at Midway, the main battleground was now definitely in the South and Southwest Pacific areas. Estimates on Japanese dispositions and capabilities indicated that they would soon be in a position to renew their drive for control of New Guinea, plate number 21. General MacArthur reported to Washington that, unless steps were taken to match the heavy ground, air and naval forces which the Japanese were assembling, a situation might develop similar to that which had successively overwhelmed Malaya, the Netherlands East Indies, and the Philippines early in the war. General MacArthur's immediate problems were to secure and strengthen his forward bases in New Guinea and to begin a counter-offensive that would drive the Japanese from Papua. Operations would have to be carried out over some of the most difficult terrain of any area in the world, plate number 22. Except for Port Moresby and Milne Bay, the Japanese possessed control of the mountain ranges and occupied the narrow coastline of all northeastern Papua. Immediate action was imperative before they could fully exploit the geographic features of New Guinea and transform their holdings into impregnable positions supported by their stronghold at Rabaul. The presence of General Horai's troops in command of the Kokoda Trail was a threat to Port Moresby that had to be removed. The security of this important strategic base demanded a counterdrive to regain the crest of the Owen Stanleys. General Horai's units could be reinforced from such key bases as Buna, Sanananda and Gona, which the Japanese were constantly fortifying by shipments from Rabaul and Kavieng. The Japanese could also threaten Milne Bay by advancing down the northeastern coast of New Guinea. Port Moresby and Milne Bay were absolutely essential to support any Allied counter-offensive in New Guinea. Their loss would constitute an irreparable blow to the Allied cause in the southwest Pacific. Without these two forward bases, all of New Guinea would soon fall to the enemy, and Australia would be open to air attack from Japanese bases less than 350 miles from Cape York Peninsula. It was a sober realization of this fact that caused General MacArthur to warn at the time, "If New Guinea goes, the results will be disastrous." General MacArthur had studied carefully the whole picture of the enemy's operations in New Guinea and decided that General Haughey had overreached himself along the Kokoda Trail. He felt that the moment was opportune for an immediate counterdrive that would catch the Japanese before they could find their second wind. In view of the changed situation, he stated, an attack to clear the north coast of New Guinea should be undertaken as soon as possible. Anticipating that the Japanese drive would abate and spend itself as it ran ahead of its supply line, General MacArthur had already started the execution of his plans for a counter-offensive before General Haughey halted at Imita Ridge on the 14th of September. I Corps, under General Eichelberger, was undergoing intensive training and re-equipment for seaborne operations and jungle warfare. On the 4th of September, General MacArthur instructed General Eichelberger to be prepared to carry out amphibious operations along the northeastern coast of Papua. He strengthened the corps in order to provide a strong spearhead for a forward thrust and placed it under the operational control of Allied land forces. In order to seize the initiative while the Japanese were attempting to regroup their forces, General MacArthur rushed all available troops into New Guinea. General Blamey moved Allied Land Forces headquarters forward to Port Moresby, and Lieutenant General Sir Edmund F. Herring replaced General Rowell as Commander, New Guinea Force. The Australian 16th Brigade and auxiliary troops of the Australian 6th Division were sent from Brisbane on the 10th of September. To ensure that no time was lost, General MacArthur directed that the 126th and 128th Regimental Combat Teams of the United States 32nd Division be transported to Port Moresby by air. The movement of these two regiments, ordered on the 11th of September, was completed in record time by the 28th of September. This air transfer from Australia to New Guinea was the first large-scale airborne troop movement by United States forces in a theatre of operations. By the end of October, General MacArthur had augmented his ground forces in Papua to comprise a total of 10 brigades and regiments, together with supporting and attached troops. Shipping resources and supply facilities were taxed to the limit to transport and maintain a force of this size. Docks for handling ships, roads for the distribution of supplies to depots, and buildings for hospitals, and the protection of material against the heat and torrential rains were inadequate at Port Moresby, almost non-existent at Milne Bay, and entirely lacking in the forward areas. These facilities had to be developed at the same time that the troops were moved into position. It was in this phase of operations that General MacArthur felt most keenly the lack of service troops. Under terrain conditions that demanded an abnormally large proportion of service elements, his barest requirements were not being filled. Construction engineers and other supporting personnel were forced to work to the point of exhaustion. The shortage of these troops was so critical that combat troops were continually called upon to unload ships, transport supplies, and perform other service duties, which diverted their energies from the fighting fronts. Instead of being accorded a period for recuperation and an opportunity for re-equipment after an area was captured, battle-weary troops had to develop their own facilities for the support of future operations. In an effort to unravel the knotty logistic problem confronting him, General MacArthur directed the formation of the Combined Operational Service Command under Brig. General Dwight F. Johns. This organization was established in Port Moresby and functioned directly under New Guinea Force as a coordinating agency between the American and Australian supply services. The consolidation of activities resulted in the increase of the cargo handling capacities of Port Moresby from under 2,000 tons to an average of over 6,000 tons daily. It also unified the utilization of shipping under the United States Army Transportation Corps and the Australian transportation units so that their combined facilities could be employed with maximum effect. General MacArthur's preparations were designed to clear the Japanese from Papua by carrying out a plan of attack along 3 axes of advance, plate number 23. One axis would engage the enemy in a frontal action along the Kokoda Trail. The second would involve a wide flanking movement over the Owen Stanleys east of Port Moresby against the enemy lines of communication and supply, and the third axis of advance would consist of large-scale infiltration from Milne Bay along the northeastern coast of Papua. The immediate objectives of the first 2 drives were to regain the Nauru and Kokoda airfields and to secure the line of the Kumusi River from Owalama Divide to the crossing of the Kokoda-Buna Trail at Wairopi. The third drive aimed at seizing selected points south of Cape Nelson and occupying Goodenough Island to deny the enemy these areas. All 3 axes of advance were to converge upon the Buna-Sananandagona area for a final simultaneous attack against this enemy coastal stronghold. The first move in the planned counter-offensive was made by the 7th Division of the Australian 1st Corps under Major General A.S. Allen. With the mission of regaining control of the Isurava-Daniki-Kokoda route, it launched its drive on the 26th of September. The 25th Brigade, reinforced, spearheaded the advance while the 16th Brigade moved up in support. The 21st and 30th Brigades, which had borne the brunt of earlier fighting along the Kokoda Trail, and the 14th Brigade were placed under the command of the Australian 6th Division headquarters and retained in Port Moresby to defend the area against a possible seaborne attack. Ioribaiwa fell to the Australians on the 28th of September after the main enemy body evacuated its defences and withdrew rapidly northward. General Allen continued to press his advance, seizing Nauru on the 30th of September. Thus General MacArthur could report, "Ioribaiwa Ridge had been captured by our troops. The enemy is retiring in the direction of Nauru, 10 miles to the north. Quantities of supplies and equipment were abandoned by him and are in our hands. The position was one of natural strength and had been prepared for defence with barricades, obstructions and field trenches. Our forward elements have captured Nauru and are continuing the advance. There was no contact with the main enemy body yesterday, which is still retiring. Additional supplies and equipment abandoned by his retreating troops have fallen into our hands. Strong formations of our attack bombers, with fighter escort, harried enemy lines of supply in the Menan area. Pursuit of the enemy was delayed temporarily by the bad state of the trail and adverse weather conditions, which hampered the airdropping of supplies. By the 10th of October, however, forward elements again met the enemy on top of the range in the area of the Gap. There, the Japanese fought tenaciously from a series of well-prepared positions on the high ground dominating the trail. The last of these was not cleared until the end of the month, when the enemy retreated toward Oivi, plate number 24. Meanwhile, troops of the United States 32nd Division under General Harding had been assigned the task of operating over the mountains east of Port Moresby along the second axis of advance. 2 routes were considered, one from Rigo and the other from Abau, both of which passed through Yaouré to Wairopi. While the United States 128th Infantry, upon its arrival in New Guinea, was temporarily allocated to the Australian 6th Division for the defence of Port Moresby, the 126th Infantry at Kappa Kappa dispatched its 2nd Battalion over the rugged trail rising more than 8,000 feet above sea level to regain control of the airfields at Nauru and Kokoda. The extreme altitude and difficult terrain greatly impeded the operations of these troops, resulting in a slowing of their advance and the postponement of their first engagements. With the Japanese still holding the higher elevations, the 126th Infantry was compelled to reorient its tactics in order to neutralize the enemy's advantages. It utilized the time to reinforce its strength and make preparations to strike. After regrouping and realigning its units, the 126th advanced in early October to engage the enemy forces and prevent their regrouping. The advance had to proceed with caution, since withdrawal would be necessary should the supply lines fail. Airstrips were cleared inland at Sapia and Kinjaki primarily for this purpose, and supply dumps were established to permit the overland retirement of troops from the coast in case of a strong enemy attack. Following the naval engagement in the Eastern Solomons on the 24th of August, no decisive action took place in the South Pacific area for about 6 weeks. During this time, however, the supply lines to Guadalcanal had to remain open. Japanese submarines and aircraft were active in the area, leading to numerous scattered actions, including the sinking of the carrier Wasp and several destroyers, as well as damage to several other ships. Despite Allied offensive operations against Japanese ground troops and naval forces, the enemy managed to deploy almost a division's worth of troops on Guadalcanal by early September. Additional Japanese fleet units had been assembled to the north, increasing the threat. Reinforcements for the Marines became imperative, even though they faced enemy land and naval superiority. On the night of the 11th of October, a United States cruiser and destroyer group surprised an enemy force off Cape Esperance, sinking and damaging several vessels, forcing the remaining ships to withdraw. Although this was a victory for the Allied forces, thanks to enemy confusion and the accuracy of Allied gunfire, the overall situation remained critical. General MacArthur continued supporting operations in the Solomons to relieve pressure on Guadalcanal. His offensive in New Guinea was, in part, a diversion meant to divide the enemy's efforts, despite the risks. The Japanese were confused by their estimate of the importance of the two theatres of operations, treating each as separate problems. This resulted in their uncoordinated reinforcement efforts. MacArthur, however, recognized that these operations were interdependent and required maximum cooperation to ensure success. He was willing to help despite his own limited resources. In a radio message to the War Department on the 7th of October, he highlighted the dire situation in the Solomons and the role his forces were playing in supporting the Guadalcanal campaign. From its inception, I have been acutely aware of the critical situation in the Solomons and in fact anticipated it and reported it with Gormley in July and August. I invited attention to the acute danger developing and begged a review of the question by the President and Chiefs of Staff, lest it become too late. Action in SOPAC has been supported to the maximum capacity of my Air Force, using all planes that can reach targets. Gormley has 3 times radioed his appreciation. It is believed that our bombardment missions have had a vital effect on the success of operations thus far. Our effort has focused on Rabaul because it can be reached with full bomb loads, while planes going to the Solomons area must carry bomb bay tanks, reducing their payload by 50%. Despite my own critical operations in New Guinea, I have supported Gormley with every bomber available and continue to coordinate reconnaissance and attacks to the best of our ability. During this time, a significant factor in the Guadalcanal campaign emerged: Allied coast watchers. These agents, sent by General MacArthur's G2, operated secret radio stations behind enemy lines to report on Japanese troop, plane, and ship movements. Strategically placed in the Solomon Islands, these agents provided radio spot reports on imminent Japanese aerial attacks. The main Japanese air bases were located at Rabaul, New Britain, Buin, Bougainville, and Buka Island, with Kavieng, New Ireland, serving as a supporting base. These coast watchers formed an intelligence network capable of giving 3 successive warnings as Japanese bombers headed toward Tulagi and Guadalcanal. U.S. forces at Tulagi and Henderson Field were able to get their planes in the air and ready to strike at the most opportune moment. The coast watchers also provided critical intelligence on Japanese harbour activities and naval movements. Despite the Allied victory at Cape Esperance, the Japanese continued their aggressive attacks on Guadalcanal. They managed to land reinforcements and another division, even as Allied forces suffered heavy losses. Japanese submarines and aircraft increased efforts to disrupt Allied lines of communication. The situation escalated as it became clear that the next major Japanese move would involve significant surface and air support. On the 18th of October, Vice Admiral William F. Halsey replaced Admiral Gormley in the South Pacific area. On the night of the 23rd of October, the Japanese launched a ground offensive against the Guadalcanal airfield, simultaneously moving naval units east of the Solomons in support. In the ensuing battle on the 26th of October, U.S. carrier aircraft from the Hornet and Enterprise inflicted heavy damage on 2 Japanese carriers and decimated 4 enemy air groups. However, the Hornet was sunk and the Enterprise was damaged, forcing the Allied fleet to withdraw. On land, the Allies repelled the enemy attack, and a counterattack restored the situation. This marked the final serious threat by Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal. Although the Japanese maintained control of the surrounding waters, the Allies engaged in operations over the next 2 weeks aimed at undermining that control. Submarines and PT boats repeatedly attacked Japanese supply lines and transport efforts. By the 6th of November, Allied forces on Guadalcanal were reinforced, and another convoy arrived between 11, the 12th of November. The Japanese, in response, launched another invasion effort, concentrating naval forces and transports in the WWII area. A decisive 3-day naval battle from the 12th of November resulted in an Allied victory, securing their position in the southern Solomons. Except for occasional small-scale supply runs by the Tokyo Express, control of the sea and air in the southern Solomons had passed to the Allies. General MacArthur believed the Japanese would continue their attempts to seize New Guinea. He was convinced that their operational strategy required holding both New Guinea and the Solomons to protect key positions necessary for maintaining dominance in the Southwest Pacific and Eastern Asia. To counter these efforts, MacArthur launched the final phase of his offensive, the simultaneous advance on Buna Sanananda. On the 6th of November, he established an advance echelon of general headquarters at Government House, Port Moresby, in New Guinea. He set the 15th of November as the tentative date for a 3-pronged drive on Buna Sanananda. On the 2nd of November, the Australian 7th Division, commanded by General George A. Vasey after relieving General Allen, captured the airfield at Kokoda. The Australians quickly prepared the landing strip to alleviate supply issues and continued their advance. Japanese forces made a resolute stand at Oivi and Gorari, but General Vasey launched a coordinated assault, with the 16th Brigade attacking head-on, while the 25th Brigade flanked the enemy positions. On the 10th of November, the Japanese were forced into retreat after suffering heavy casualties. General MacArthur described the successful envelopment and defeat of Japanese forces. The enemy was forced from his main positions near Oivi with heavy losses. His retreat has been blocked by our enveloping troops astride the main track, and he is attempting to cut his way through. Simultaneously, our forces enveloped and destroyed enemy forces trapped south of Gorari. Our ground troops have reached the vicinity of Illimore. Here, the enemy defending force has been surrounded. Of the enemy detachment, which was encircled and destroyed at Gorari, bodies of 5 officers and more than 500 men have already been counted in the jungle. In the Oivi pocket, several hundred additional dead have been found. Allied fighters cooperating with ground units strafed and silenced enemy positions in the rear areas. The surviving Japanese set out for Buna. The main body moved toward the coast by plodding laboriously along the flooded west bank of the Kumusi River. A few attempted the hazardous trip down the river itself on hastily improvised rafts. Hearing the heavy mortar fire in the direction of Buna, and feeling that his immediate presence on the coast was imperative, General Hori decided to speed his progress by riding one of these rafts to the mouth of the Kumusi River and then paddling along the shore to the Buna area. He succeeded in reaching the sea with only one mishap, but during the short trip from the river mouth to the Japanese headquarters by native canoe, the general and his staff officer were drowned during a squall. Many of his troops, however, succeeded in escaping down the Kumusi to the coast and eventually reached Gona to join in its defence. On the 14th of November, New Guinea Force issued instructions for the Australian 7th and the United States 32nd Divisions to advance toward the sea from their positions on Hydrographer's Range. The 7th Division was ordered to move from the vicinity of Haganahambo toward Sanananda Gona, and the 32nd Division up the coast from the vicinity of Oro Bay and Bofu to Buna. The boundary between the two forces was formed by the Girua River, and followed a stream running southwest between Inonde and Popondetta. The combat zone, in which the final Papuan operations took place, is a low, flat coastal plain stretching inland from Gona and Buna to the foothills of the Owen Stanley Range. It is covered with dense jungle, strips of forest, and large kunai grass patches, with extensive sage and mangrove swamps bordering the coast. The area is divided by the Jirua River, which empties into a broad delta stretching between Sanananda Point and Buna village. The overflow from the river runs into the low-lying ground south of the Buna government station and the Buna airstrips, forming with the delta a thick, impassable swamp. Movement was generally limited to the few native tracks, which, although following the higher ground, were muddy at all times and hopelessly boggy in wet weather. In the Buna-Gona area, there were 5 native trails. 1. Soputa to Sanananda. 2. Junbora to Gona. 3. Soputa to Buna village. 4. Dobodora to the Buna airstrips. 5. The coastal track north through Cape Endayadere. The Australians crossed the Kumusi River on the 14th of November and quickly constructed a bridge at Wairopi. By the 17th of November, the 2 Australian brigades were across the bridge in pursuit of the Japanese. The 25th Brigade, moving along the Junbora-Gona track, was held up about a mile south of Gona by strongly resisting enemy forces. On the following day, the 16th Brigade, on the Soputa-Sanananda track, encountered well-prepared positions a mile and a half north of Soputa. East of the Jirua River, the movement of the United States 126th and 128th Infantry Regiments from Port Moresby was completed by air transport to the Wanigela, Pongani and Sapia landing strips. The use of air transport not only speeded the placement of combat troops on the fighting lines, but also served to avoid the extreme physical exhaustion of a march through the New Guinea jungle, a factor which had proved so costly to the Japanese in their initial advance. By the time the Australians had defeated the Japanese at Uivi and Gorari and pushed across the Kumusi River, the American forces under General Harding had started forward. The rapidity of their advance and the devious paths of the difficult terrain divided the units of the 32nd Division into 2 main groups. Urbana Force was deployed along the Ango-Buna track and contacted the enemy about a mile south of Buna. Warren Force was situated in the coastal area south of Cape Endayadere on a line running inland to Sinemi Creek. 1 battalion of the 126th Infantry had crossed the Girua River at Inonde and, joining forces with the Australian 7th Division, had remained to participate in the defence of Soputa and the subsequent operation on Sanananda. Thus, by the end of November, the Japanese were pinned down in the narrow coastal strip from Gona to Buna, and, with the sea at their backs, faced the Allied forces to the west and south. It was hoped that a coordinated drive of the 3 Allied forces, poised before the last remaining enemy strongholds in Papua, would gain an early victory. The Japanese, however, realizing that they could no longer retreat without forfeiting the vital air bases along the northern coast, were determined to hold their positions no matter what the cost. They accordingly took every advantage of the terrain, prepared strong defences in depth, and fought with great courage and tenacity. The final phase of the struggle for Papua and the reduction of the enemy pockets on the northern coast witnessed some of the most gruelling and savage fighting of the entire campaign. During the operations along the Kokoda Trail, enemy troops remaining in the Bunagona area had methodically prepared a series of well-designed and extremely strong defences. Every contour of the terrain was exploited, and the driest stretches of land were carefully chosen to be occupied and fortified, making it impossible for the Allies to execute any lateral movement without becoming mired in swamp. All potential roads of approach were cleverly channeled into narrow corridors along tracks which led into a murderous crossfire of well-hidden machine guns. The western flank of the Buna defences was protected by the sea and the unnavigable bog of the Girua River. The worst swampland in the Buna area, between Entrance and Sinemi Creeks, formed a wide, impassable stretch joining with the thick jungle to protect the middle of the line. The eastern flank was anchored on the seacoast south of Cape Endayadere. While any movement of the Allies from one flank to the other would have entailed an arduous 2-day trek via Ango and Sinemi, the Japanese could move by fast motor transport inside the perimeter of their defences to bolster any weakening point almost immediately. West of the Girua River, the enemy position protecting Sanananda constituted a deep beachhead roughly triangular in shape, the apex 3½ miles inland on the Soputa-Sanananda track, and the base resting on strong points along the coast between Cape Killerton and Tarakina. Gona, strongly fortified, was a flank position to the northwest. To complicate the problem of piercing the enemy defences, the already difficult logistical situation had become even more critical. Allied lines of communication were stretched 1,700 miles from Australia to the landing strips and supply dumps along the coast of New Guinea. Rations, ammunition and equipment for Urbana Force and the Australian 7th Division were generally transported by the 5th Air Force from Port Moresby to Dobodura and Popondetta. Flying weather was usually bad, and for days at a time supply planes were grounded, unable to penetrate the thick, low-hanging clouds which veiled the gap. This break in the supply line at such a crucial period caused the failure of the first Allied thrust at the enemy's coastal defences. When elements of the 25th Brigade attacked Japanese positions at Gona on the 19th of November, they were forced to withdraw because of a shortage of ammunition. Warren Force was supported by light vessels creeping along the coast from Port Moresby to Porlock Harbour and thence to Oro Bay, where the Combined Operational Service Command had established advance bases. At Oro Bay, the supplies were transferred to small craft for movement to Hariko. Jeeps, trailers and native porters then took over the task of transportation to the forward areas. This limited means of conveyance, under constant threat of enemy air and sea attacks, restricted the flow of supplies and equipment to the barest essentials. As an additional aggravation, the New Guinea jungle and swamp were unrelenting in their toll of disease and sickness. The troops in the Buna area were beginning to suffer from an increasing malaise and lassitude engendered by the stifling climate and an insufficient food ration. The incidence of illness climbed rapidly as man after man was stricken and hospitalized, with at least one of the multitude of ever-present fevers which infested the entire region. Initial assaults against the enemy entrenchments failed to achieve any appreciable gains. General Blamey, feeling that his covering artillery fire was inadequate to support a frontal attack, proposed that an amphibious landing be made at the rear of the enemy's positions at Buna. The lack of small landing craft, however, and the fact that the Navy was unwilling to risk destroyers and corvettes in the shallow, uncharted and dangerous waters off Collingswood Bay prevented his plan from being carried out. The Allied offensive, therefore, unable to pierce the enemy's powerful positions by frontal assault and incapable of mounting an amphibious flanking manoeuvre, had to give way to painstaking infiltration tactics. The situation developed into a virtual stalemate, with activity on both sides restricted to sporadic thrusts by small groups. In fact, the entire Buna campaign was characterized by feats of the individual soldier, constantly isolated from his main unit and left to his own resources in the fight against the enemy. In order to break the existing deadlock, General MacArthur sent a new commander, General Eichelberger, to direct the Allied forces attacking Buna. He arrived with his staff at Dobodura on the 5th of December and took charge of the operations east of the Girua River. General Eichelberger found that the units of the 32nd Division had become badly disorganized during the fighting, seriously weakening the chain of command. He proceeded immediately to regroup the scattered units and at the same time reorganize the supply system, which had become disrupted and unreliable. Corps and division staffs were merged to form Headquarters Buna Force. The combined United States and Australian troops north of the Owen Stanley Range were placed under General Herring, commander of Advanced New Guinea Force, whose headquarters were established at Popondetta on the 28th of November. General Blamey acted in the dual capacity of Commander New Guinea Force and Commander Allied Land Forces until after the fall of Buna, when he returned to Australia. Brig General Albert W. Waldron replaced General Harding as commander of the United States 32nd Division. On the 5th of December, General Eichelberger's reorganized forces made a coordinated attack on both fronts in another effort to dislodge the Japanese. They resisted stubbornly, however, determined not to yield a foot of ground. Warren Force made repeated assaults, only to be thrown back exhausted and disheartened. The efforts of Urbana Force proved more successful. By resourceful leadership and daring exploits, a platoon of the 126th Infantry managed to pierce the enemy network of interlacing bunkers and break through to the sea. The enemy counterattacked immediately, but the units on the Urbana front held doggedly to their corridor, which wedged into the enemy defences, isolating Buna village from Buna mission. For the first time since the beginning of the campaign against Buna, the Japanese line had been breached. General MacArthur insisted that immediate advantage should be taken of the gains on the Buna front, and directed that maximum strength be concentrated in that sector, while the Japanese were contained west of the Girua River with a minimum force.